I didn't choose the desert because it was peaceful. I chose it because it was merciless. I wanted something vast and final. A place where nothing could follow minute the pain, not the memories, not the sounds of a house that used to be full of life and now echoed like a tomb. I walked out into the heat with no plans to return, dragging blistered feet through sand that scorched through the soles of my shoes. The sun peeled the skin from my shoulders and blurred the horizon into a shimmering lie, but I welcomed every cruel lash it gave me. I wanted the world to punish me one last time before I disappeared in it. I carried nothing. Not water, not food, not hope. I'd left all that behind long ago. My arms, once used to cradling lullabies, now hung empty. My heart, once swollen with love, had been hollowed out with a single fevered night I couldn't undo. I didn't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. Time didn't matter, only distance. Distance from the bed I'd sat beside until the breathing stopped. Distance from the stares of people who said they understood, but whose eyes betrayed their judgment. Distance from the mirror that showed a stranger every morning. I was going to vanish where no one would find me, where the silence would swallow the last of my breath and leave nothing behind. But then I heard it. A sound that had no business existing in this lifeless hell. Faint, broken, crying. At first, I thought it was in my head, that my body had begun its final betrayal, conjuring phantoms as my mind unraveled. But it came again soft, rasping, barely more than a whimper but real. A tiny, desperate thread of sound that tugged at something inside me I thought was long dead. I turned toward it without thinking, moving more from instinct than intent. There, under a twisted mesquite tree clinging to life in the sand, lay a bundle. A bundle of rags, crying. My legs moved on their own. My heart, which hadn't beaten for anything in months, thudded once hard enough to make my chest ache. I stumbled to my knees beside the bundle and reached out with shaking hands, terrified of what I might find. The rags were stiff with dust and sun, but within them, barely clinging to life, was a child, a baby, a girl. Her lips were cracked and dry, her cheeks sunken, and her skin radiated with the fever of someone far too small to fight it. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Her breath hitched in her throat as I touched her, and her eyelids fluttered like paper in the wind. I pulled her close to my chest before I even realized I was doing it. She felt like nothing in my arms weightless, like she might vanish if I let go. But she was alive. Barely. Alive. And just like that, something in me shifted. Not all at once, not in a way I understood, but in the space where I had planned to die, I suddenly couldn't. Not while she was still breathing. Not while this fragile flame fought for life in the same place I'd chosen to surrender mine. I looked around, frantic. There was no water, no sign of whoever had left her here. Only the cruel sun, the dry air, and that dying tree that had barely enough strength to cast a shadow. She needed help, more than I could give. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not anymore. She clung to me with fingers too small to hold anything, but I felt the grip anyway. She wasn't just holding on. She was tethering me to the world. I stood up, dizzy and disoriented, the baby pressed against my chest. I had walked for hours into this wasteland, and I'd have to walk back if I could even find the way. My throat was a desert itself, cracked and dry. My body screamed for rest. For surrender, but hers hadn't even had a chance yet. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. But I knew she wasn't going to die out here, not if I had anything left to give. I wasn't prepared for the desert to fight back. I thought I had already lost everything: my child, my hope, my will to live, and that walking into the endless sand was surrender. But the desert doesn't just let you go quietly. It claws at you with every grain of sand, every blister, every cruel ray of sun. And now, with the baby pressed against me, it felt like it was trying to rip me apart. Her tiny body was burning. I could feel the heat radiating through the thin fabric I'd wrapped around her, and I knew the fever was higher than anything I'd faced before. My lips were cracked and bleeding, my throat so dry I couldn't swallow without pain. But I had to keep moving. If I stopped, she would die. And I couldn't let that happen. Not after finding her, The wind kicked up suddenly, whipping sand into my eyes and mouth, forcing me to shield the baby with my body. The sun was a cruel overseer, unforgiving and relentless. It burned the land and everything on it. I wanted to scream at the sky, to demand mercy, but all that came out was a broken cough, rasping and dry. I tried to remember the way back to town, but the desert was a cruel mirror. Everything looked the same. The sand stretched in every direction, broken only by thorny bushes and the skeletal remains of long-dead creatures. My mind began to falter, dizziness washing over me in waves. I was exhausted beyond words, and yet the weight of the baby was a tether keeping me upright, forcing me to keep going. Every step felt like walking through fire. As the hours passed, her crying stopped. That silence terrified me more than any scream could. When a baby stops crying, it isn't because they've given up. It's because they're too weak to fight anymore. I tightened my grip, feeling her tiny chest barely rising and falling. The pulse of life was faint, like a fragile thread stretched thin against a storm. I wanted to shout for help, but there was no one. No water, no shade, no salvation. Only the endless desert. In the depths of my despair, a sound broke the silence, hoofbeats pounding across the sand. My heart jumped. Riders? Were they rescuers? Or worse? 3 men appeared in the distance, racing toward me like shadows come to life. Relief and fear warred inside me. As they came closer, the truth became clear. These weren't men bringing salvation. They were hunters. Their faces were covered with scarves, eyes cold and hard. The leader rode a tall, imposing horse and carried an air of menace that set every nerve on edge. The other 2 flanked him, moving like wolves closing in on prey. I instinctively backed away, clutching the baby tighter, but there was nowhere to run. The desert offered no shelter, no escape. The dying mesquite tree was behind me, the barren wasteland ahead. They stopped mere feet away, circling me like predators. The leader dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving me or the bundle in my arms. I could smell the whiskey on his breath even before he spoke, his voice rough and bitter like the desert wind. "Well, well," he said with a cruel smile. "What do we have here? A woman and a baby, lost in the desert." His gaze flicked to the baby, and I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. This wasn't about rescue, this was about possession. Something dark, something dangerous. I whispered, voice cracking. "The baby needs water. She's dying." He laughed, a harsh, grinding sound that cut through the tension like broken glass. "Dying, you say? What a shame. But I'm more interested in why a fine-looking woman like you is wandering the desert with someone else's child." Fear twisted inside me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I didn't know these men, but it was clear they believed I was someone else. Someone who had stolen something valuable. One of the younger men shifted uneasily in his saddle, casting nervous glances between me and their leader. "Boss, maybe we should." "Shut up, Tommy," the leader snapped. He fixed me with a cold stare. "We're looking for a woman who took something from our employer. Something valuable, someone like you." My mind raced. What could they be talking about? I was no thief. I'd come here to die, not to steal, I told them, voice shaking but firm. "I don't know what you mean. I found this baby abandoned. I'm trying to save her." The leader's hand drifted to the gun at his hip. "Touching story. But our employer's wife and newborn daughter disappeared recently. Seems too coincidental." Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. This baby wasn't just abandoned. She was stolen, left to die. I tried to explain, to tell them the truth. But how do you explain you came to die, only to find a reason to live? The younger rider, Tommy, leaned forward, eyes softening. "Boss, look at her. She's half dead herself, and the baby needs help." The leader ignored him, eyes narrowing. "Where's the money? The wife took a considerable sum when she ran off with the child." I shook my head, desperate. "I don't have money. I don't know about theft. But this baby is innocent. She needs help." His gun gleamed in the harsh sunlight as he stepped closer. "We're searching you. If we don't find what we're looking for." The threat hung heavy in the air. But then, without warning, A gunshot cracked through the desert. The leader spun, eyes wide, scanning for the shooter. 3 guns rose, aimed toward the horizon. From behind a rocky outcrop, a woman emerged with a rifle trained on them. She was younger than me, hair tangled by the wind, dress torn but defiant. "Step away from her!" she called out, voice steady despite the distance. "That's my daughter." Shock froze the men. The leader's face twisted into a cruel grin. "Rosalie Thorne, we've been searching for you." This was the kidnapper, the woman who had stolen the baby and left her in the desert. But why? Why was she threatening the men working for her husband? Rosalie took slow steps forward, rifle unwavering. "Step away, my daughter needs help," the leader laughed, voice thick with venom. "Your daughter? The one you stole and left to die? While you ran with his money?" Her voice cracked with pain. "I didn't leave her to die. I hid her." I looked down at the fevered child in my arms. The baby's breath was so faint, I had to press my ear close to feel it. "Whatever happened," I called out, voice trembling, "she needs water now, or she won't survive." Tears streaked down Rosalie's face as she took in the child's fragile state. "Is she alive?" "Barely," I answered. Rosalie's composure broke. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing in the sand. The leader sneered. "Where's the money? Mr. Thorne wants it all back." Rosalie's voice hardened. "That baby is not property. Neither am I. I ran because my husband sold me like cattle. He planned to sell our daughter too." Suddenly, everything fell into place. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a desperate mother trying to save her child from a man who treated his family like livestock. Tommy lowered his gun slightly. "Boss, maybe we should think about this." The leader snapped at him, but his certainty wavered. The baby coughed weakly, eyes fluttering open for the first time since I found her. I felt a crack in the darkness, a flicker of hope, but the leader's eyes gleamed with cruelty. "Mr. Thorne wants justice. His wife and daughter must return." Justice, a word so hollow it echoed in the desert wind. I looked at Rosalie, broken and sobbing, and then at the baby who had saved me. I realized the fight was no longer just for survival. It was for the very soul of this child. The desert sun had never felt so heavy, as if it wasn't just burning my skin, but scorching my very soul. The sand beneath my feet, once a vast emptiness I thought could swallow me whole, now seemed a battleground where every moment was a fight for survival. The baby, so small and fragile in my arms, was more than a burden. She was the only reason I clung to life. The others, Rosalie, the leader, Tommy, they faded around me, their faces sharp but distant, as if the desert itself blurred their edges. Rosalie was broken. I could see it in the way her hands trembled and her gaze darted between the men and the child I held. She was a woman carrying a weight so crushing that it bent her back and shattered her spirit. She'd stolen her own daughter from a man who treated her like cattle, trying to save her from a fate worse than death. But even that desperate act had come at an unbearable cost. The fire that took the other baby, the burning house, the impossible choice, all these shadows stretched long across the sand, threatening to suffocate us all. The leader, cold and merciless, seemed to breathe poison. His eyes burned with a hatred born not just from loss, but from a thirst for control. To him, this baby was property and asset to be reclaimed, a debt to be settled. And the gold that had changed hands, the promises whispered in shadowed halls, turned this desert encounter into a twisted game with innocent lives as stakes. Tommy, the youngest of the group, was a flicker of doubt in this harsh reality. His reluctance to carry out orders was a crack in the armor of cruelty that surrounded us. But even he was trapped in the desert's grip, caught between loyalty and morality, between the orders of his boss and the desperate cry of a dying child. I stood between these forces, the fragile life in my arms weighing heavier than any physical burden. My own grief had been a quiet companion, smothered beneath a numbness that I thought was permanent. But now, with Hope, the baby I had named in my heart, everything shifted. My pain was no longer mine alone. It was shared, multiplied, and I would fight with everything left in me to protect this tiny, flickering flame. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of dust and desperation. Time was running out. Each breath the baby took was a fragile thread in the tapestry of fate. The leader's voice cut through the heavy silence again, sharp as a whip. He didn't care about our stories or our pain. Justice, he said, was what mattered. But I knew his justice was a lee-masked greed and cruelty dressed as law. I looked at Rosalie, her tears carving dirty trails through the sand on her cheeks. Her brokenness was real, her guilt deeper than the desert's scars. Yet despite everything, she'd risked her life to protect her child. That made her a mother, not a criminal. The baby stirred, her tiny fingers curling weakly around mine. I pressed my lips to her forehead, feeling the faint heat of fever. She was slipping away, and I felt the terror settle like ice in my chest. There was no room for doubt, no space for fear. The desert was ruthless, but so was I now. The leader barked orders, his men preparing ropes and saddles to take us back. Their mission was clear: reclaim the property and the criminal. But I was no one's property, and this baby was not a commodity. I moved, slow but deliberate, raising hope where everyone could see her. Her lips were blue, her breath shallow. I shouted for them to look, to see the human life in my arms, not a bargaining chip. The wind carried my voice, raw and desperate. Tommy's eyes softened. He stepped forward, pulling a water flask from his saddle and handing it to me. With shaking hands, I offered the water to the baby, drops sliding over her cracked lips. She stirred, a flicker of life returning, fragile but real. Rosalie lowered her rifle, hope breaking through her despair. She approached cautiously, tears of relief mixing with the sand on her face. But the leader remained unmoved, his grip on his gun tightening. He spoke of debts and gold, of legal claims and vengeance. He cared nothing for the baby's life, only for what the child represented in a cruel game of survival and profit. The desert stretched endlessly around us, a vast emptiness that mirrored the cold emptiness in his heart. In that moment, I realized the fight wasn't just for the baby's survival, it was for her soul, for her future, for her right to live free from the shadows of her past. I stepped forward, standing tall despite the exhaustion burning through me. I declared that no one would take this child anywhere without her consent, that she was more than a possession, more than a price tag, that she deserved love, safety, and a chance at life. The leader sneered, but for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. The rules he had lived by suddenly felt fragile, threatened by a woman broken and yet unyielding. The standoff stretched on, tension crackling in the hot air. The desert held its breath with us, waiting for the next move. I held hope close, feeling the fragile rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest. She was more than a survivor. She was a symbol of defiance, of hope against all odds. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fierce oranges and reds, I knew the real battle was just beginning. This desert had secrets yet to reveal, and I was ready to face them all. The desert wind carried the scent of heat and dust, but beneath it, I could almost hear whispers, faint echoes from a past I desperately wanted to bury. Yet here I was, drawn into a storm far darker than the searing sun above. Holding hope close, I felt the weight of more than just the baby in my arms. There were memories, regrets, and shadows long buried beneath my skin, clawing their way to the surface. The others waited, tension so thick, I could taste it like grit in my mouth. The leader's eyes never left me, calculating, cold, as if weighing my worth like a piece of broken glass. Rosalie sat on the ground, tears staining her face, a broken woman caught in a trap of her own making. But I couldn't look away from the baby, that fragile, fevered life clinging to my heartbeat. She was my tether to the world, the fragile hope that somehow, despite everything, I could rewrite my own story. The truth was, I had walked into this desert with one purpose: to disappear, to fade away from a life that had broken me beyond repair. But fate, with its cruel sense of irony, had other plans. As the sun sank lower, turning the sky into a blazing canvas of red and gold, The leader barked out orders, his voice sharp like shattered glass. "We move at dawn," he said. "No one goes anywhere until this child is returned. No excuses." His words hung in the air, but they carried a threat deeper than the desert night. I knew the desert was merciless, but these men were something else, predators hunting in human skin. That night, under a sky flecked with cold stars, I sat beside a dying campfire, the baby's soft breathing the only sound that anchored me. I thought of my own past, of the life I had left behind in the shadows of a city that never knew my name. The years before the grief, before the pain, when hope had been a bright flame rather than a flicker. I had been a woman with dreams, with plans. A wife once, a mother too. But loss had twisted everything, and the desert had become my escape, a place to vanish and let the world forget. But finding hope had changed everything. Her life was a defiant spark in the vast emptiness, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. Rosalie came to me that night, her voice trembling, her story spilling out in fractured pieces. She told me of debts, of threats, of a man named Thorn who had sold more than just his soul to survive. A man who saw his family as currency, whose desperation had driven a wedge between love and cruelty. She was running from him, from his men, from a life of pain she refused to accept any longer. Listening to her, I realized our fates were intertwined by more than just blood. We were both survivors of a cruel game, caught in a desert of broken promises and shattered lives. As dawn broke, casting pale light over the endless dunes, the camp stirred. The leader moved with cold purpose, his men ready to act. But I had made a choice to fight, to protect this child no matter the cost. I tightened my hold on hope, feeling the fragile beat of her heart against my skin. No one would take her from me. Not without a fight. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but so was I. And as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, I knew that whatever waited beyond these sands, I was ready to face it. Because in this endless sea of sand and sky, I had found a reason to live. The dawn broke with a harshness that matched the pounding in my chest. The desert, with its endless waves of sand and searing heat, was already coming alive with the threat of another merciless day. I held hope tighter than ever, her frail body pressed against mine, her shallow breaths a painful reminder of how little time we had. The air was dry and heavy, each inhale a challenge, but I refused to let despair claim me again. Around us, the men stirred like shadows awakened from a restless slumber. The leader's eyes met mine once more, colder now, his patience stretched thin but his resolve unwavering. He believed he held all the power, the law, the money, the muscle to drag us back to a fate none of us wanted. But I had something they didn't. I had a fire that refused to be extinguished, a will forged in loss and hardened by survival. Rosalie was silent, broken but present, her guilt weighing her down like chains buried in the sand. I could see the tremor in her hands as she touched the earth, as if seeking forgiveness from the very desert that had swallowed her secrets. I understood her pain. It was a mirror of my own, a reflection of loss and impossible choices that had left us both stranded on the edge of oblivion. Hope whimpered softly, the heat stealing her strength like a thief in the night. I wet a cloth with the scant water we had left, brushing it gently against her fevered skin, willing her to hold on. Her eyes fluttered open, briefly tiny, dark orbs that searched the vastness around her, trusting and innocent. I whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Promises that she would live, that she would be safe, that the desert would not claim her as it had claimed so many before. But survival here was a battle against more than the elements. The men were hunters, driven by greed and desperation. The desert was their domain, and they knew its secrets, every hidden crevice, every trap laid beneath the shifting sands. I was the prey, a woman clinging to a child in a land that gave no quarter. As the sun rose higher, turning the sky into a blazing furnace, we prepared to move. The leader's men readied their horses, ropes, and weapons, their faces masks of determination and cold calculation. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken threat that the next step could be our last. But I was not ready to give in. I had made a vow to protect Hope at any cost, to fight against the darkness that sought to consume her. And so I stood, weary but unbroken, a lone figure against the vast, merciless desert. We set out, the horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the blazing light. Every step was a test of endurance, every moment a struggle against the creeping exhaustion that threatened to steal my strength. Hope's breaths grew shallower, her body weaker, but I refused to let the despair take hold. The desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of sand with no horizon in sight. The sun beat down like a relentless hammer, and the wind whispered warnings through the scrub brush. I thought of the life I had left behind, a world of pain and loss, of dreams shattered and hopes extinguished. But I also thought of the future, a fragile spark kindled in the heart of a tiny child who deserved a chance to live. The leader rode beside me, his eyes sharp and cold. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant reminder of the danger that shadowed every step. He saw me as a thief, a criminal who had dared to claim what was not hers. But I was no thief. I was a guardian, a protector, and I would not let him win. Hours passed, the heat intensifying, the landscape blurring into a shimmering haze. I felt my body weakening, my lips cracked and dry, my tongue heavy and parched. But Hope was more than my burden. She was my reason to keep going, my beacon in the desolate wasteland. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the distant roar of engines, a harsh mechanical sound that cut through the stillness like a knife. I froze, my heart pounding as I scanned the horizon. Dust clouds rose in the distance, the unmistakable sign of vehicles approaching fast. The men tensed, their hands tightening on reins and grips. The leader's eyes narrowed, his face hardening with suspicion and caution. Whoever was coming was not part of their plan. The vehicles drew closer, kicking up clouds of sand and grit. And then the figures emerged, a small convoy of trucks, armed and determined, moving with purpose. My mind raced. This was no ordinary rescue party. This was a rival faction, another piece in the deadly puzzle that surrounded us. The desert was not just a place of isolation. It was a place where alliances were fragile and tensions could erupt at any moment. The leader barked orders, urging his men to prepare for a confrontation. I clutched Hope tighter, feeling her fragile warmth against my chest, knowing that whatever happened next could mean life or something far worse. The trucks stopped abruptly, dust settling as armed men stepped out, alert and wary. The desert air thickened with tension, a storm ready to break. Voices rose, commands exchanged, and the fragile calm shattered. In the chaos, I saw Rosalie's face twist with fear and urgency. She knew these men, or at least she recognized what they represented. Shadows from her past, threats that had driven her to the desert in the first place. The leader faced the newcomers steadily, his stance guarded, ready for whatever was coming. The two groups stood off, a powder keg on the edge of ignition. And in the middle of it all, I stood, holding Hope, the tiny life that had become the heart of a storm none of us could avoid. My heart hammered with fear and resolve. I had come to this desert to die, but now I fought not just for survival, but for a future. The lines were drawn. There was no turning back. The desert was no longer just a vast, empty space. It had transformed into a battleground, a place where desperate souls collided over a child who embodied hope and survival. The air was thick with tension, every breath sharp with unease. The trucks had come to a halt, engines still warm under the burning sun. Armed men moved carefully, their eyes alert and wary. I stood firm, holding Hope as best I could, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Every second felt like borrowed time, slipping away too fast. The leader's voice cut through the noise, low and commanding. "They're here for the deal," he said. "We hold our ground. No one takes her knot today." Rosalie's eyes darted anxiously between the two groups, her hands trembling slightly. the weight of past mistakes and present dangers pressed down like the unforgiving desert heat. This wasn't just a fight over money. It was a clash of lives shaped by betrayal and desperation. A sudden shout echoed from the newcomers, and tension spiked. Without warning, movement became rapid and tense, instinct urging caution. I crouched protectively over Hope, feeling the fragile warmth of her body, heart pounding louder than everything else around me. Time slowed, the chaos, a violent storm raging around us. I could feel every moment etched into my skin, the hot sting of sand against bruised flesh, the sharp crack of gunfire, the raw fear that pulsed through my veins. Yet, amidst the fury, something inside me hardened. This child Hope was more than a lifeline. She was a symbol of defiance, a beacon that demanded I fight even when my body begged for surrender. The firefight wove a deadly dance around us. Men shouted orders. Bullets tore into horses and tires. Dust clouds rose like specters in the unforgiving light. The leader fought with a brutal focus, his cold eyes scanning, calculating, every move deadly precise. I saw Tommy beside him, face pale but resolute, a reluctant soldier caught in a war he never wanted. Rosalie vanished into the chaos, a shadow flitting between rocks and brush, desperate to escape or to find help. I didn't know which. All I could do was hold Hope and wait. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into an oven, the heat pressing down on my skin like a living thing. My lips cracked and bled, but I dared not loosen my grip. Hope's breath was growing shallower. The fever wasn't abating. Suddenly, a sharp cry tore through the Dinah's scream, not of pain, but of warning. Someone had been hit. The ground shook beneath me as a rider crashed, horse and man tangled in a deadly fall. Blood seeped into the sand, stark against the pale earth. Fear surged through me. If any of these men fell, the fragile balance would shatter and the desert would claim us all. I pressed a wet cloth to Hope's skin, murmuring promises, begging her to hold on. "You're strong," I whispered. "You have to be." Minutes stretched endlessly, the battle ebbing and flowing like a storm on the horizon. Then, unexpectedly, a blast of gunfire rang close too close. I felt a searing heat slice past my arm and I stumbled, the world tilting dangerously. The leader shouted, dragging me down behind a boulder. "Stay low." His voice was harsh, but beneath it, a flicker of concern. I looked down at my arm, blood seeping through torn fabric, but the pain was distant, eclipsed by the urgency of Hope's failing strength. "Water," I gasped. "She needs water." Tommy appeared beside us, eyes wild with fear, but hands steady as he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. "Small sips," he warned, kneeling to pour a few precious drops into Hope's cracked lips. The baby stirred, a faint flicker of life that made my chest ache with hope and fear intertwined. But the reprieve was short-lived. More men were closing in, and I knew the desert would soon demand its price. Every breath was a battle, every step a fight for survival. I couldn't let Hope die here, in this wasteland of death and broken dreams. As the firefight raged, I made a decision, a desperate gamble that might cost me everything. I would find a way out, find a place beyond this nightmare where Hope could live. And if it meant running through the desert alone, I would do it. Because this child had saved me from darkness. Now, I would save her from the desert's cruel embrace. The desert wasn't just a place of heat and sand anymore. It had transformed into a crucible where every choice meant life or death. Holding Hope tightly in my arms, her fragile body warming against my own, I realized the battle we were caught in wasn't just with guns and men. It was against time, against the desert itself, against the weight of my own past that clung to me like a shadow refusing to fade. The air shimmered with heat so intense, it made the world seem unreal, a mirage on the edge of madness. The gunfire had died down to cautious shots, the riders regrouping, their voices hoarse from shouting orders in the heat. Somewhere in the distance, Rosalie's hurried footsteps echoed against the barren rocks. She was trying to find help, to escape this nightmare. But she was alone out here, and the desert was merciless. I wanted to scream for her to come back. I wanted to tell the men to stop this madness, but my throat was dry, cracked, and my voice was buried deep beneath the roar of fear and exhaustion. Hope's breathing was shallow now. Each tiny breath a struggle that squeezed my heart tight. I could feel the fever burning her from within, her little body limp and fragile like a bird with a broken wing. Every moment without water, without care, was pushing her closer to the edge of life and death. The leader's eyes caught mine across the dusty battlefield. For a split second, there was something unreadable there, maybe regret, maybe resignation. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't move. Maybe even he realized that none of this was worth another life lost in the desert. I swallowed the burning lump in my throat and forced myself to speak, voice trembling but desperate. "We need to move. Now, before the sun takes her." Tommy stepped forward, eyes filled with conflict but steady hands offering me the last full canteen of water. "We have to get her out of this heat," he said. "But there's no safe path back to town. The roads are blocked. We're trapped." Trapped? My voice was a whisper, disbelief and terror mixing like poison. "Then what are we going to do? She can't survive out here." He shook his head. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The only chance is to move deeper into the desert, find shelter, find shade, find water. I know of an old well, hidden by some rocks. If we can get there before night, it might be our only chance." The leader spat on the ground. "You're crazy." But there was no conviction in his voice anymore. Rosalie appeared again, breathless, eyes wild with exhaustion. She was clutching a makeshift satchel, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I found something," she said urgently. "A map. It shows a route to the well." Hope stirred weakly in my arms, and something in me broke. I couldn't let this child die in the desert, not after all she had been through. "Then we move," I said, standing unsteadily. Now, the trek was a nightmare. Each step was agony, the blistering sun beating down with merciless fury. The sand was burning beneath my feet, the heat rising like waves that threatened to consume us. Hope's fever seemed to grow worse with every passing minute, and I could feel my own strength draining away. The group fell into a tense silence as we navigated the rough terrain. The well Rosalie had found was far, and the desert around us stretched endlessly, a barren wasteland of heat and dust. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on sand, the wheezing breaths of the baby in my arms, and the distant caw of a lone vulture circling overhead. I kept whispering to Hope, words of comfort and promises of safety that I wasn't sure I believed myself. "Hold on, little one, just a little longer." At one point, I stumbled, the searing pain in my injured arm reminding me how close I was to collapse. Tommy caught me just in time, steadying me with a firm grip. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "I don't know if I am," I admitted, teeth clenched against the pain. "But I have to be." Hours passed, like days. The sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert's cruel beauty. We were all exhausted, and Hope was slipping further into weakness. Then, just when despair threatened to swallow us whole, Rosalie's voice broke through the silence. "Here," she said, pointing to a rocky outcrop. "The well is just beyond that ridge." We pushed ourselves forward, every step a battle. My arms ached, sweat stung my eyes, and my heart pounded with a desperate hope. Finally, we reached the well, a weathered stone structure, half hidden by thorny bushes and cracked by the relentless desert sun. The air around it was cooler, shaded, a small miracle in the barren wasteland. I lowered Hope gently to the ground and cupped my hands inside the well, pulling up the cool, dark water. I pressed the damp cloth to Hope's fevered lips, watching as she drank, her tiny fingers curling weakly around mine. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. The baby's breathing steadied, and the fever seemed to break just enough to give us hope. But the relief was short-lived. The leader's voice cut through the quiet, tense as ever. "We're not safe here." "Why not?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Because this well isn't just a source of water," he said grimly. "It's a trap." He explained how the well had been used before as a trap by bandits, and that the enemy riders were closing in fast. We had to leave before they found us. The thought of moving Hope again, of leaving the only place of safety we'd found, was unbearable. But the desert didn't care about our desperation. We packed up quickly, moving as quietly as we could through the shadows of the dying day. I wrapped Hope close to me, fighting tears that burned hotter than the desert sun. That night, under a canopy of cold stars, we camped briefly in a narrow canyon. The cool air was a balm to my fevered skin, but I couldn't relax. The dangers lurking in the darkness were as real as the day's scorching heat. Hope slept fitfully, her tiny body still fragile but alive. I sat on a rock, staring into the vast emptiness, wondering how we had ended up here lost in the desert, hunted by men who cared more about money than life, carrying a child who was more precious than anything I'd ever known. Tommy sat beside me, his voice slow and cautious. "You ever think about what happens after all this?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I know one thing. I'm not letting her die out here. Not if I have anything left." He nodded. Me too. As dawn approached, the desert wind whispered warnings across the sand. The next day would decide everything. Would we escape this hellish chase? Or would the desert finally claim us? All I knew was that Hope's life, fragile as a desert flower, depended on the choices I was about to make. And I was ready to fight for her, no matter the cost. The dawn broke like a fragile promise, bleeding soft pink and gold across the endless desert sky. But promises in the desert are as fleeting as the shadow of a bird on the sand here one moment, gone the next. I woke with a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, the dry air scratching my throat like sandpaper. Hope was still asleep, curled in my arms with her fragile breath barely rising and falling. She looked so small, so delicate, like a leaf barely clinging to the branch of a dying tree. I was desperate to keep her alive. More than anything, I wanted to believe that somewhere beyond this barren wasteland, a life awaited her, a life filled with love, safety, and hope. But all I could see was the harsh sun rising, the unending miles of sand that seemed to stretch forever, and the shadows of the men who hunted us drawing ever closer. The others were stirring quietly. Tommy and Rosalie sat nearby, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. The leader sat apart from the rest, eyes scanning the horizon, calculating, always calculating. No one spoke much. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken fears and doubts. I swallowed the lump in my throat and wrapped my arms tighter around Hope. She shifted slightly, opening her eyes, those dark, trusting eyes looking straight into mine, and I felt my resolve harden like stone. I would protect her. I would fight for her, no matter what. We broke camp as the first rays of sun pierced the desert cold. The well had offered us only a brief respite, a cruel illusion of safety in a place that held none. Our destination was a hidden valley Tommy had spoken of, a place he called the Green Cradle, a secret refuge where water flowed and shade grew like a miracle in the midst of the wasteland. The journey was brutal. The desert's heat returned with a vengeance, waves of unbearable fire shimmering off the ground beneath our boots. Every step felt like walking through a furnace. My injured arm throbbed and my legs burned with fatigue, but I kept moving. For Hope. The baby's fever seemed to be breaking, but she was still too weak to carry herself. I held her close, shielding her from the sun's merciless gaze as best I could with my body in the tattered scarf I'd wrapped around us both. Rosalie stumbled a few steps behind, her face pale and drawn. I could see the toll the desert was taking on her, but I didn't have the energy to ask if she was okay. We were all fighting ghosts, chasing shadows of hope in this endless wilderness. Tommy rode alongside us, his eyes darting nervously. "We're not out of danger," he warned. "Those riders won't give up. They'll track us until the last breath." The leader grunted in agreement. "And we don't know what else waits out here. The desert's full of its own kind of monsters." As the sun climbed higher, the landscape began to change. The endless sea of sand gave way to rocky cliffs, sparse shrubs, and patches of dry grass. The heat was less brutal here. tempered by the promise of shade. I dared to hope, but the desert didn't give its gifts freely. Suddenly, a shout broke the silence. "Riders! On the ridge!" My heart leapt into my throat. Ahead, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of horses racing toward us. The riders had found us. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. There was no way to outrun them on foot. We had to fight, or find a way to hide. The rocky terrain offered little cover, but Tommy pointed toward a narrow canyon nearby. "There, we can use the rocks for defense. It's risky, but it's better than facing them out in the open." We scrambled toward the canyon, dragging Hope and what little supplies we had. The riders thundered after us, their voices carrying across the dry wind, shouting threats and demands. I felt a surge of fear, not just for myself, but for Hope. Her life hung by a thread, and if we lost this fight, it would all be over. We took up positions behind the jagged rocks as the riders closed in. The leader dismounted, gun drawn, his eyes wild with fury and greed. "This ends now," he snarled. "Hand over the child." I lifted Hope higher, holding her like a shield. "No, she's not yours." His men circled us, weapons ready. The air crackled with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on us all. I glanced at Rosalie and Tommy. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but we had something they didn't, though, and the desperation that comes with it. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The leader laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "So be it." The firefight erupted with deafening violence. Bullets whipped past us, kicking up dust and shattering rocks. I hugged Hope to me, shielding her as best I could, every instinct screaming to protect her from harm. Tommy fired back, his aim steady despite the chaos. Rosalie moved with surprising agility, her rifle cracking sharp shots into the advancing riders. The leader charged forward, gun blazing. I felt the heat of the bullets as they whizzed past my head. My heart pounded, fear and adrenaline mixing into a fierce determination. I knew this was more than a fight for survival. It was a battle for a future where Hope could grow up free, loved, and safe. The battle raged on, but slowly the tide turned. The riders began to falter, their numbers thinning under our desperate defense. The leader growled in frustration, his face twisted with rage. But before he could make a final charge, Tommy tackled him, wrestling the gun away. With the leader disarmed, the remaining riders scattered, retreating into the desert dust. Silence fell over the canyon. I collapsed against a rock, breathless, my body trembling from exhaustion and relief. Hope stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at me, her small hand reaching out. I smiled through my tears. "You're going to be okay, little one. I promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert, we made our way into the valley Tommy had spoken of. It was a place of miracle slush greenery, a clear spring bubbling from the rocks, shade offered by ancient trees, a sanctuary in the heart of the desert. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. We set up a small camp near the spring. I washed Hope's fevered skin with cool water, feeling her strength slowly return. Rosalie sat nearby, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving her." I nodded, exhausted but grateful. "We'll keep her safe, no matter what." Tommy tended a small fire, his eyes watching the stars as they began to twinkle above. The desert was silent now, but the battle was far from over. That night, as Hope slept peacefully in my arms, I looked up at the endless sky, stars stretching like diamonds across the dark velvet. I thought of all we had lost, the lives shattered by greed and desperation, of the baby sister who had died in the fire, of Rosalie's broken heart, and of the man who sold his own blood to pay debts. But most of all, I thought of Hope. She was more than a child lost in the desert. She was a symbol of hope, resilience, and love. And I vowed to protect her with everything I had, no matter the cost. The desert may be unforgiving, but so was I. And as the dawn approached once more, I knew one thing for certain. Our fight was just beginning. The peace we found in that hidden valley was fragile, a brief breath in a world that still threatened to swallow us whole. I could feel it every time I closed my eyes. The desert was watching, waiting for its next move. The men who hunted us hadn't given up, and the truth was, neither had I. Hope's fragile body rested against my chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing a small victory against the chaos that surrounded us. Her eyes, dark and deep, reflected the flickering firelight, and sometimes, when she smiled even the smallest smile, I dared to believe we might actually survive. But the desert's silence was deceptive. Rosalie and Tommy stayed close. She was haunted, still carrying the weight of her impossible past, and he was a steady presence, a rare light in the endless night. They didn't say much about what happened back at the canyon. Words felt meaningless against the heavy backdrop of what we had been through. At night, when the desert's chill crept in, I'd watch Rosalie stare into the fire, her face pale and drawn, as if battling the ghosts that chased her from every corner of her mind. Tommy would sit nearby, tense and watchful, his hands never far from his rifle. None of us were safe. Not really. Days passed in a blur of heat, thirst, and quiet terror. I knew the leader wasn't just some outlaw. He was a man with dangerous allies, with resources and reach that made the desert itself seem tame by comparison. I tried to keep hope alive. Every drop of water, every crumb of food, was a precious gift I rationed with trembling hands. Her fever came and went, and with every day that passed, her survival seemed less like a miracle and more like a battle. One morning, after a restless night, I found myself alone near the spring, watching Hope sleep in a makeshift cradle of blankets. The silence stretched around me, broken only by the soft sound of water trickling over rocks. I thought about my life before the desert, before the heartbreak. The house I left behind, empty and haunted by memories I couldn't escape. My own son, gone. My hope, shattered. The decision I made to walk into the desert to end it all. And then hope. This tiny life, abandoned but not broken, clutching to existence like I wished I could. The sound of hoofbeats shattered my reverie. I spun around just in time to see a small group of riders approaching through the haze, not the men who hunted us, but strangers. Men and women, armed but cautious, their faces marked by years of hardship and resilience. Tommy was the first to recognize them. "The Rangers," he whispered, awe mixed with relief. They pulled their horses to a halt, eyes scanning the camp. Their leader, a tall woman with fierce eyes and a scar running down her cheek, dismounted swiftly. "You're the ones with the baby?" she said without preamble. "We've been tracking that group. They're bad news." I clutched hope tighter, relief flooding through me. Finally, help. The Rangers moved quickly, setting up a defensive perimeter around our camp. They were skilled, their movements efficient and purposeful. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe we might have a chance. The leader introduced herself as Sarah. She spoke in blunt, honest terms about the dangers we faced. "The man who sent those riders after you doesn't just want his property back," Sarah explained. "He's tied to something bigger, a network trafficking children, women, everything they can exploit for profit." Her words hit me like a blow. I realized then that Hope's story was part of a far darker web, one that stretched far beyond this desert. That night, as we huddled around the fire, Sarah told us about the organization, a ruthless syndicate that dealt in human lives, using deserts and remote places as hunting grounds. "They don't care about families or innocence," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Only power and money." I looked down at Hope sleeping peacefully in my arms and felt a surge of determination I hadn't known I possessed. If they thought they could use her as a pawn, they were dead wrong. "We have to get her out," I said quietly. "Somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach." Sarah nodded. "We can get you to the border. From there, it's safer, but the journey will be dangerous." Over the next few days, the Rangers guided us through hidden trails and secret paths carved into the desert by those who knew its secrets well. The landscape changed from barren wasteland to rugged mountains, winding canyons, and finally to sparse patches of green. Hope grew stronger with each mile. Her cheeks flushed with color, and her cries grew less frequent. I watched her, marveling at her resilience, but every step forward brought new challenges. The leader's men were relentless, sending scouts and trackers who nearly caught up with us more than once. One night, under a blanket of stars, we were ambushed. The battle was fierce. Bullets tore through the night air, shadows clashing in the darkness. I held Hope close, her tiny body trembling in my arms as the chaos raged around us. Tommy fought like a man possessed, covering our retreat as Sarah directed the Rangers in a fierce defense. The leader himself appeared, eyes burning with fury and hatred. "You can't run forever," he snarled, leveling a gun at me. Time slowed. I closed my eyes, willing Hope to stay quiet, to be safe. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood tall, fire in my eyes, and faced him. The standoff was brutal. We were outnumbered, but I refused to back down. I held Hope up, letting the desert moonlight catch her fragile face. "She's not property," I said, voice steady despite the fear choking me. "She's a life, and I'll fight to the death to protect her." The leader's gun wavered. For a moment, I thought he might hesitate. But then the shooting resumed. When the dust finally settled, the leader lay wounded but alive, his men scattered or captured by the Rangers. Sarah approached me quietly. "You did good," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But this isn't over." I nodded. I knew she was right. The desert had tested us, broken us almost beyond repair. But it hadn't won, and neither would the darkness behind those men. The journey to the border was grueling, but Hope's strength and spirit never faltered. I whispered promises to her, words of love and protection, pledging to build her a future free from fear. As the border came into view, a ribbon of hope against the endless desert, I felt the weight of what we had survived settle on me. We had escaped the desert's grasp, but the scars remained. Now, as I hold Hope in my arms, watching her sleep peacefully, I realized that our story is just beginning. The desert tried to break us, tried to claim us both, but we chose to fight. And in that fight, we found something stronger than the desert's hope. The border lay just beyond the horizon, a thin line between the nightmare we had fled and the fragile promise of safety. As the sun began to rise, casting pale light over the rugged landscape, I felt something inside me shift a quiet, unshakable strength. Hope stirred in my arms, her tiny fingers curling around mine. She had survived the desert, the hunters, the darkness, and now she would survive what came next. Sarah and Tommy rode close behind, vigilant but hopeful. We had beaten the desert's deadly grip, but the real battle was only just beginning, fighting for justice, for truth, and for the kind of life that no child should ever be denied. As we crossed into safety, I whispered to Hope, "You are not just surviving, little one. You are a light, a new beginning." And in that moment, I knew we were no longer lost. The desert had tried to break us, but it only made us stronger. Because sometimes, the fiercest storms bring the brightest dawns. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional tales that touch the heart and ignite the soul. Thank you for joining me on this journey.